Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's Notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil for yet another engaging conversation.
Okay, so today we're diving into this really loaded question, is Donald Trump a fascist? And to help us unpack this, we have an expert with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So before we even get to Trump, let's take a step back and define what fascism even is. How would you even begin to define fascism?
Well, you could look back at some historical regimes that were widely recognized as fascist.
Like Hitler's Germany or Mussolini's Italy.
Exactly. And you start to see some core elements there, like extreme nationalism, an objection of democratic principles, the glorification of violence, and the suppression of any dissent.
So it's not just about having like a charismatic leader, but like a whole system of control and repression.
Yeah, precisely. Fascism is all about creating a totalitarian state where the individual is completely subservient to the state and the leader, and they use things like propaganda and censorship and violence to keep control and shut down any opposition.
So that's pretty scary. But fascism isn't just something from the past, right? Like, there have been concerns about fascist tendencies popping up even in democracies today.
Yes, and that's why it's so important to understand the nuances of fascism and how it can kind of morph into different forms. It's not always like jackboots and tanks and a dictator taking over. Sometimes it's more subtle. It can be like the erosion of democratic norms or manipulating language and culture or the normalization of authoritarian tactics.
So how can we recognize these less obvious types of fascism? Are there any, like, frameworks or definitions that can help us see the warning signs?
Yeah, there are. One is from the historian Robert Paxton. He argued that fascism is not really a fixed ideology, but more of a process with 5 stages.
5 stages. That sounds interesting. What are those stages?
Well, the first stage is the creation of a mass movement. And this is a movement that's driven by grievances and often a sense of victimhood. And this movement will try to exploit divisions and anxieties that already exist in society to create a sense of unity and purpose amongst its followers.
So they're like tapping into people's fears and frustrations.
Exactly. And then this movement tries to gain a foothold in political institutions, usually by hooking up with more conservative elites who see them as a way to advance their own agendas.
That makes sense. So the movement gets stronger, then what?
Stage 3 is the actual seizure of power. And this often happens when there's a crisis or some instability, when people are really looking for strong leadership and decisive action.
So they take advantage of a moment when people are vulnerable.
Exactly. Once they have the power, the fourth stage is using that power through authoritarian means. So dismantling institutions, suppressing anyone who disagrees, controlling the media.
So they basically get rid of anything that could check their power.
Precisely. And the final stage can either lead to even harsher repression and violence, or the movement just loses steam and falls apart.
So it's like a reminder that fascism isn't just history. It's a very real threat that can appear in different ways depending on the situation. But Paxton focuses on how these fascist movements actually gain power. Are there any frameworks that help us figure out the ideology behind fascism regardless of the time period?
Yeah, there's one that's pretty well known. It's called Fascism by Umberto Eco. He came up with 14 characteristics that he thinks are common to all fascist movements.
14. Wow, that's a lot. Can you give us some examples and how they might show up in today's world?
Sure. One is the cult of tradition, which basically means glorifying a mythical past and rejecting anything modern. This often means appealing to nostalgia and a sense of lost greatness, saying that the present is corrupt compared to some glorious past that needs to be brought back.
So they're basically creating this romanticized version of the past to make the present look bad.
Exactly. Another is the rejection of modernism, which means distrusting intellectuals' science-critical thinking. They paint academics and experts as elitist and out of touch with regular people.
So they're trying to get rid of any kind of knowledge or expertise that could challenge them.
Precisely. And this is connected to another characteristic, action for action's sake, a disdain for any kind of logical debate and a preference for just doing something, even if its reckless fascist movements often glorify violence and say it's necessary to reach their goals.
So it's like action over thinking, gut feeling over reason.
Yeah, and this often creates a culture where people are afraid, where anyone who disagrees is silenced and anyone who opposes them is met with violence or threats.
So they make it so people are too scared to speak up or challenge them.
Right, and with this comes a sense of victimhood, a belief that the group is under attack from outsiders or even traitors within the group. This creates a siege mentality that makes them feel like they have to take extreme measures to protect the group and its interests.
So they're constantly suspicious of everyone, both inside and outside the group.
Yeah, and that leads to scapegoating, blaming a specific group or person for all the problems. This can be based on race, religion, ethnicity, anything that sets the target apart from the dominant group.
So they create this us versus large situation where anyone who is them is evil and a threat to us.
Exactly, and this often leads to a kind of selective populism, where the movement says they speak for the real people against a corrupt elite. This is really effective at getting support and justifying their actions, even if those actions are harmful or undemocratic.
So it's like they're twisting the idea of democracy to support their own agenda.
Exactly. And that often involves manipulating language and controlling the media to control what people think and to shut down anyone who disagrees. They use propaganda and censorship to make sure the information that gets out supports their goals.
So they're not just controlling what people do, but what they think as well.
Exactly. And this can be very effective, especially now when people are overloaded with information from so many sources. It's hard to know what's true and what's not.
It's scary to think that fascism isn't just about brute force. It's about manipulating language, culture, and information.
That's why it's so important to be aware of these tactics and to learn how to think critically so we can resist them.
You've definitely given us a lot to think about. But let's get to the main question. How do Trump's actions measure up against all these definitions and characteristics of fascism?
That's a complicated question that requires looking at his actions, his rhetoric, and the whole political scene he's operating in.
Okay, well, let's start with his actions. The paper you sent over says that Trump has been chipping away at American democratic institutions. Can you give us some concrete examples?
Well, one of the biggest examples is how he keeps attacking the integrity of the voting process, especially after the 2020 election. Even though there's no proof, he kept saying there was widespread voter fraud, and that made people distrust the whole system and even contributed to the January 6th riot.
And these attacks haven't stopped, right? What's he been doing in his second term?
He's still pushing for measures that make it harder for people to vote, especially minorities. Things like stricter voter ID laws, purging voter rolls, and limiting early and mail-in voting.
It seems like he's deliberately trying to rig the system in his favor and stop certain groups from voting. Is that something authoritarian leaders do?
Yes, it's a tactic that's been used throughout history. If you make it harder for certain groups to vote, you can control the outcome of elections and stay in power.
It's unsettling to see someone disregard the idea of fair elections so blatantly. What else has he done to undermine democratic institutions?
His attacks on the judicial system are also a big concern. He's constantly attacked judges who rule against him, calling them activist judges or saying they're biased.
Yeah, I remember his tweets and speeches criticizing any judge who didn't side with him.
Exactly, and that makes people lose trust in the courts. It makes them seem like just another political tool instead of an independent part of the government that upholds the law.
But he's also appointed judges who agree with him, right? Isn't that how it works?
Yes, presidents do get to appoint judges, and they often choose people who share their views. But Trump is doing more than that. He's trying to fill the courts with loyalists who will rule in his favor no matter what. And his attacks on judges who don't agree with him create a chilling effect. They could influence future rulings and weaken the independence of the judiciary.
It sounds like he wants the courts to serve him, not the Constitution.
That's a major concern. And another problem area is how he's expanding executive power and weakening the legislative branch. He keeps using executive orders to make big policy changes without Congress's approval.
Like what? How has he bypassed Congress with these executive orders?
He's used them for controversial policies on immigration, environmental regulations, even foreign policy decisions. He's basically going around the checks and balances that are supposed to limit presidential power. All presidents have used executive orders, but Trump is taking it to a whole new level. He's using them to make huge changes that normally require new laws.
So he's ruling by decree, cutting out the legislative process and putting all the power in his own hands.
That's a big worry, and it's gotten worse in his second term. He's signed executive orders that give him more control over independent federal agencies, basically forcing them to follow his agenda instead of acting as independent watchdogs. This includes important financial and regulatory agencies, which raises serious questions about accountability and oversight.
It seems like he's dismantling all the protections that are supposed to safeguard our democracy.
That's the core issue. By grabbing power for the executive branch and weakening the other branches of government, he's creating a system that is ripe for abuse. It's concerning.
It is incredibly worrying. But I think it's fair to say that not everyone agrees with this view of Trump. Some people say that while his actions are ruism, they don't actually mean he's a fascist. They say it's more like right-wing populism. What do you think?
That's an important counterargument that we need to address. While Trump does show some authoritarian tendencies, there are some key differences between what he's doing and what we've seen with historical fascism.
Let's talk about that. What's the difference between right-wing populism and fascism? Where does Trump fit in?
One key difference is the level of control they want. Classic fascism, like we've been discussing, is about total control over everything. The economy, the media, education, even people's personal lives. Think of Nazi Germany or Mussolini Italy. They wanted to create totalitarian states where everything and everyone served the regime.
So it's about total domination, getting rid of any opposition. And right-wing populism doesn't go that far.
Not always. It shares some things with fascism, like nationalism and authoritarian leanings, but it doesn't always try to control everything. Right-wing populists might challenge democratic institutions and norms, but they don't always completely destroy them.
So they might try to bend the rules, but they don't throw the whole rule book out.
You could say that they might attack the media, but they don't necessarily shut down every dissenting voice. They might criticize the judiciary, but they don't necessarily abolish the courts.
So it's still dangerous, but maybe not as immediately threatening as full-blown fascism.
Right, but it's important to remember that right-wing populism can lead to more extreme forms of authoritarianism. If it's not checked, it can erode democratic norms and create conditions where a more openly fascist movement could take hold.
So it's not a simple choice between populism and fascism. They exist on a spectrum.
Exactly, and where a particular leader or movement falls on that spectrum can change over time depending on the circumstances and how far they're willing to push things.
That's an important point to keep in mind when we're analyzing Trump's actions. Because even if he doesn't fit the classic image of a fascist dictator, his behavior can still be a big threat to democracy. Where do you think he falls on that spectrum?
Well, his actions and his words certainly raise concerns. His attacks on democratic institutions, his acceptance of violence and intimidation, and his attempts to control the media and silence dissent all point to authoritarian tendencies. However, it's also true that he hasn't completely destroyed democratic institutions, and there's still pushback from different parts of society.
So it's a complicated and changing situation. We need to stay alert and carefully evaluate his actions without jumping to conclusions or exaggerating.
I agree. Nuance and careful analysis are essential when we're talking about such a sensitive and complex issue. That's right. It's important to avoid rushing to judgment and instead focus on understanding what his actions really mean and how they could affect democratic norms and institutions.
Okay, so we've talked about how Trump has shown some troubling behaviors, but let's dig a little deeper into some specific areas where we see these tendencies. The paper you gave me points to his use of political violence and intimidation as a major red flag. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. Well, throughout his time in politics, Trump has consistently used language that incites violence and encourages aggression amongst his supporters. We saw this a lot during his rallies, where he'd make inflammatory statements, often targeting his opponents and sometimes even suggesting that violence against them was okay.
I remember times when he seemed to be condoning violence against protesters at his rallies. He would say things like, "Knock the crap out of them," or "I'd like to punch him in the face."
Exactly, and these words have consequences in the real world. What he says emboldens extremist groups and individuals who then feel justified in using violence to achieve their political goals. We saw this in a very tragic way on January 6, 2021, when a mob of his supporters attacked the U.S. Capitol. Many of the people involved in that attack said that Trump's words were what inspired them.
And even after the January 6th attack, he still uses language that could incite violence. He often calls his opponents enemies of the people or traitors. That kind of talk creates a really dangerous atmosphere of fear and division.
Yes, it does. By demonizing his opponents and making them seem like existential threats, he's essentially saying that violence against them is okay. This is a classic tactic used by authoritarian leaders to silence any dissent and hold on to their power.
And it's not just his words. He's also built relationships with far-right extremist groups, some of which openly engage in violence and intimidation groups, like the Proud Boys, for example.
Yes, the Proud Boys are a perfect example. They call themselves a Western chauvinist organization, and they have a history of violence. Trump has repeatedly refused to condemn them. In fact, during one of the presidential debates, he told them to stand back and stand by. A lot of people saw that as him quietly approving of what they do.
And it's not just the Proud Boys. He's pardoned people who were convicted of violent crimes that they committed in his name. Remember when he pardoned several people who were convicted of offenses related to the January 6th attack?
Yes, those pardons sent a very clear message that violence in support of his agenda is acceptable and might even be rewarded. This undermines the rule of law and makes people think they can get away with violence if they're doing it for him.
It's almost like he's creating his own private army of loyalists who are willing to use violence to get what he wants.
It's a disturbing thought, but yes, that's a pretty accurate assessment. And it's important to remember that this kind of behavior isn't unique to Trump. It's a pattern we're seeing with right-wing populist movements all over the world. Using violence and intimidation as political tools is a defining characteristic of authoritarianism.
So it's not just an American issue, it's something happening globally that we need to be aware of and actively fight against.
Absolutely. Democracy is a fragile thing, and it needs constant protection from those who would try to weaken it through violence and intimidation.
This conversation has taken a pretty dark turn, but I do think it's important to have these tough conversations. If we want to understand the danger facing our democracy, we have to be willing to look them straight in the eye.
I completely agree. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. By talking openly about these troubling trends, we can raise awareness and hopefully encourage people to do something about them.
Let's change gears for a moment and talk about another area where Trump has caused concern. His relationship with the media. He's always been very critical of the press. But do you think this criticism has crossed a line into something more dangerous?
Yes, I think it has. While every president has had disagreements with the media, Trump's approach has been much more aggressive and hostile. He keeps calling the media the enemy of the people and accusing journalists of spreading fake news. This rhetoric not only hurts the reputation of the press, it also creates an atmosphere of distrust and suspicion that can lead to violence against journalists.
I remember times when he would point out specific reporters at his rallies and encourage his supporters to harass them. It was really unsettling.
It was, and this behavior has real consequences. Reporters Without Borders says that attacks on journalists in the U.S. have gone up a lot since Trump took office. This is a direct result of his inflammatory rhetoric and his attempts to make people think the press is illegitimate.
And it's not just verbal attacks. He's taken actual steps to limit press access and freedom. Remember when his administration banned CNN reporter Jim Acosta from the White House press briefings?
Yes, that was clearly him trying to punish a journalist for asking tough questions. And it's not the only time it's happened. His administration has repeatedly tried to make it harder for the press to get access to events and information. They've even revoked press credentials from journalists they don't like.
That sounds a lot like what authoritarian regimes do, trying to control information and silence anyone who disagrees.
Exactly. A free and independent press is crucial for a healthy democracy. When journalists are threatened, harassed, or silenced, it takes away the public's ability to hold those in power accountable.
It's like a slippery slope. Once you start chipping away at press freedom, it won't be long before other democratic norms and institutions are also under threat.
That's an important point. Press freedom is a warning sign. When it starts to decline, it's a signal that democracy itself is in danger.
Okay, so we've talked about Trump's attacks on the media. But what about his own use of propaganda? Do you think he's tried to manipulate information and spread disinformation?
Absolutely. His administration has been a major source of misinformation and propaganda. They've repeatedly lied, distorted facts, and spread conspiracy theories. This creates a situation where it's hard for people to tell what's true and what's not. It breeds confusion and distrust.
Yeah, I remember the constant stream of tweets and statements that were often contradicted by evidence or even by things he had said before. It felt like a flood of disinformation.
It did, and this constant flow of misinformation has been really damaging to public discourse. It's made people lose trust in institutions and made it harder to have reasonable conversations about important issues.
And it's not just about spreading lies. He's also tried to discredit trustworthy sources of information. He's attacked intelligence agencies, scientific experts, and fact-checking organizations. It's a classic move by authoritarian leaders to make people distrust any source of information that might challenge their story.
You're right. By discrediting legitimate sources of information, he creates a space that he can then fill with his own propaganda. This is a very dangerous tactic that can lead to a society where people can't tell the difference between truth and lies anymore.
It's like he's trying to invent his own reality where only his version of events matters.
You could say that. And it's a tactic that's been used by authoritarian leaders throughout history. By controlling information and shaping how the public sees things, they can consolidate their power and silence anyone who disagrees with them.
This has been a sobering conversation, but it's important to remember that we're not helpless in the face of these threats. We can and must resist these authoritarian tendencies wherever we see them.
I agree. We need to be vigilant, informed, and active citizens. We need to support a free and independent press, hold our leaders accountable, and speak out against injustice. Democracy is a precious gift that we should never take for granted.
So welcome back to our deep dive into whether Donald Trump is showing fascist tendencies. We've talked about a lot already, but there are still some important areas to cover. I want to focus on Trump's approach to foreign policy, his attempts to influence culture, and what all of this means for the future of democracy in America. Let's start with his foreign policy. How does Trump's approach to international relations differ from past presidents? Does it fit with any of the characteristics of fascism we discussed earlier?
Well, Trump's foreign policy is a pretty big shift from the traditional way both parties have handled American foreign relations for decades. One of the most noticeable differences is that he doesn't like working with other countries and prefers to act alone. He's pulled the U.S. out of major international agreements like the Paris Climate Accord and the Iran nuclear deal. He's put tariffs on goods from allied countries, which has started trade wars. He seems to see the world as a competition where if America wins, someone else has to lose. It's very different from the more cooperative and diplomatic approach of previous presidents.
And this move towards going it alone seems to come with a more aggressive and confrontational attitude towards the rest of the world.
Yes, he's repeatedly threatened military action against countries like Iran and Venezuela, and he said he's willing to use force to get what America wants, even if it means breaking international law. This has made the world a more unstable and unpredictable place, and it's pushed away a lot of America's traditional allies.
So he's not just stepping back from the world stage, he's actively trying to change it to benefit American interests, even if it means upsetting existing alliances and breaking the rules.
Exactly. And he often justifies this approach with rhetoric about nationalism and America first, putting American interests above everything else, even if it hurts other countries or violates international norms.
That reminds me of the nationalist rhetoric we discussed earlier as a hallmark of fascism. Is there a link there?
There are definitely some similarities. Nationalism, especially when it's driven by resentment and a sense of superiority, can easily lead to conflict and aggression. Trump's rhetoric often taps into those feelings, portraying America as a victim of other countries' unfair actions and saying that America needs to show its dominance on the world stage.
So his foreign policy isn't just about pursuing American interests. It's also about restoring America's greatness, even if it means using force or intimidation.
That's one way to look at it, and this rhetoric really resonates with a certain group of people who feel like America has lost its way and needs a strong leader to bring back its former glory.
And this focus on restoring past glory connects with another characteristic of fascism we mentioned, the cult of tradition. He seems to be appealing to a nostalgic view of America's past to get support for his policies.
That's a sharp observation. He often paints a rosy picture of America's past and contrasts it with what he sees as the decline of the present. This appeal to nostalgia can be very powerful, especially when people are feeling uncertain and anxious.
So his foreign policy isn't just about practical politics. It's also about tapping into deeper cultural anxieties and resentments.
I think that's a key part of why he's so appealing. He understands that foreign policy isn't just about military strength or economic power, it's also about identity and values. And he's been very successful in framing his foreign policy in a way that speaks to a certain segment of voters.
This brings us to another area I wanted to discuss, Trump's attempts to manipulate culture. Can you give us some examples of how he's tried to shape cultural norms and values to fit his political agenda?
One of the clearest examples is how he pushes a narrow and exclusionary kind of nationalism. He consistently uses rhetoric that divides Americans by race, ethnicity, and religion, and he's put policies in place that target immigrants and minorities.
Like when he called Mexican immigrants rapists and criminals, and when he implemented the Muslim travel ban.
Exactly. Those are just a couple of examples of how he's used divisive language and policies to appeal to a base that feels threatened by cultural and demographic shifts.
And this strategy seems to be working. He's been very successful in mobilizing a group of supporters who are deeply suspicious of anyone who's different and who see him as a protector of traditional American values.
Yes, and this strategy has been effective partly because it speaks to deeper worries about cultural change and national identity. In a world that's changing so fast, where traditional sources of identity and belonging are being challenged, a lot of people are looking for stability and certainty, and Trump gives them a simple and reassuring message: America is under threat, and he's the only one who can save it.
This focus on creating a sense of danger and then presenting himself as the savior reminds me of another fascist characteristic we talked about, the obsession with a plot. He always seems to be creating a sense of crisis and then saying that he's the only one who can fix it.
That's an interesting connection. He's very good at creating a narrative of fear and then offering himself as the strong leader who can bring back order and security.
So his attempts to manipulate culture aren't just about promoting certain values, it's also about holding on to power and silencing dissent.
That's a key point. By creating an atmosphere of fear and division, he can push his opponents to the sidelines and create a sense of urgency that justifies his authoritarian actions.
This has been a fascinating and honestly pretty disturbing conversation. We've covered a lot, from the origins of fascism to the specific ways Trump has shown fascist tendencies in what he does and says. But what does it all mean? What are the implications for the future of American democracy?
That's the big question. It's hard to say for sure what will happen, but it's clear that American democracy is facing a serious challenge. The norms and institutions that have always been the foundation of American democracy are under pressure, and there's a real risk that they could be damaged beyond repair.
Are you saying that Trump's presidency isn't just a one-off, but a sign of a deeper problem in American society?
That's what I think. The things that have allowed Trump to gain power, the economic anxieties, the cultural resentments, the distrust of institutions, those aren't going away anytime soon. And those things create the perfect environment for authoritarianism to take hold.
So what can we do? Is there any hope of turning things around?
I believe there's always hope, but it's going to take a real effort from everyone to defend democratic values, to rebuild trust in institutions, and to create a more just and fair society.
What are some specific things we can do?
There are many things. We need to strengthen civic education, promote media literacy reform, campaign finance laws, protect voting rights, and hold our leaders accountable for their actions.
That sounds like a huge undertaking.
It is, but what's at stake is too important to give up hope. The future of American democracy depends on whether we're willing to fight for it.
You've given us a lot to consider. Thank you for sharing your insights and expertise with us today.
It was my pleasure. I hope this conversation has been helpful and has encouraged listeners to think critically and talk about the challenges facing our democracy.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this episode has helped you understand the complexities of fascism, how it can show up in modern politics, and the threats it poses to democratic values and institutions. Remember, democracy isn't a spectator sport. It needs all of us to participate and be vigilant. Stay informed, stay involved, and never stop fighting for the values that make America great.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.